And thank you for inviting me back. I'd planned being here anyway, but I'd planned to be alongside you in the pews. I'd not anticipated speaking again. Your kindness in asking me is going to be repaid, though, unfortunately, by my disappointing you. Most aspects of our topic, the church, won't even be mentioned. Though if you'd like to raise any with me afterwards, you're more than welcome. You see, tackling everything, we'd overrun by several hours. And also, there's a real risk that we'd lose sight of the wood for the trees. It's to avoid that I chose our passage, Peter's miraculous release from prison, precisely because it shows the church pared down to bare essentials. It's spring 44 AD, Passover season. James is executed, Peter is about to be. Is it an exaggeration, do you think, to reckon that the worst moment in all church history? So much so that it wasn't simply Peter who was saved, but the church itself. Actually, I'm not completely sure I'm right about that. I've never heard anyone else say it. But even if I'm remotely right, our passage warrants more than the attention it usually gets. And how do we see the church rising to that challenge? Tell me, does one laugh or cry? There's a disarming honesty in the account, as well there should be, in sheer relief that God got them through it. But frankly, the Christians are shown so feeble, befuddled, one couldn't make it up. Peter supposes he's dreaming. He fails to realize he's being released. He fails to recognize an angel. He's himself mistaken for one. Rhoda. It's Rose in English, and as she's just a maid, let's call her Rosie. Rosie is so thrilled, she abandons Peter outside, where possibly he might have been arrested again. She then goes in and is dismissed as balmy. Peter eventually gets in, gesticulating to suppress the celebrations. I suppose because, again, if there was a lot of noise, there was a risk he might attract attention and be arrested again. And all this confusion, this bedazzled confusion, why? In response to God's bringing about the very thing they were praying for. Did I exaggerate the danger? Decide for yourself when I've reviewed three aspects of the background. First, how was this predicament different? Second, why were Christians a target? And third, who exactly was Herod, the Herod in this story? Marcus Julius Herod Agrippa. I'll call him Agrippa later to save confusion with the rest of his family. How was this different? There'd been troubles before. Stephen was martyred well before James. Peter had been imprisoned before, along with all the other disciples. Previous situations were serious, certainly, but they couldn't have put an end to the church because they were orchestrated by the Jewish religious leaders. And what those people could do was severely limited unless they secured Roman approval. Jesus, they'd crucified by portraying the matter to Pilate as political. Stephen they lynched and got away with it since it was done in the temple precincts. But Pax Romana meant they couldn't just go out and kill. Paul's lifestyle makes the point for us rather nicely. When persecuting Christians, his brief only permitted him to fetch them back to Jerusalem. Okay, there they'd have been browbeaten and probably really beaten as well. But the temple didn't have the resources to imprison great numbers indefinitely, and certainly the temple couldn't execute. What befell Paul later, when he was a Christian missionary, shows how far the Jews might, but also might not, go. In our passage, though, it's no longer the Jews threatening the church, it's Agrippa. So secondly, why were the Christians targeted? Now, there are people who assume that the church started off getting everything right in some splendid first flush of Pentecostal inspiration. The trouble is, the New Testament shows the first Christians had virtually no idea how to run a church. They were often at odds over it. Some early features had to be abandoned, selling everything and pooling their money, for example, or being led by three people known as three pillars. Oh yes, the church was enthusiastic, devoted, determined, but also rather hit and miss. There was trial and error, and no wonder. Jesus left what? Practically nothing to go on. At least nothing to do with practicalities. He encouraged prayer and confidence in God as a loving Father. He stressed that we should gratefully respond to that by loving our neighbours. He approved disciples baptizing adherents. He instructed them to remember him, in particular his death for them, in commemorations of the Last Supper. Also, additionally, rather mysteriously, he did promise the Holy Spirit would come and would lead them into truth. But how were those things going to be organized? How were they going to be implemented? The Gospels are resoundingly silent. The word church occurs, how often? Just twice in all the Gospels. And then seems so out of context that, to be honest with you, most biblical scholars think that they're later interpolations. The fact is, the church had no blueprint, no ideology. And I'm very grateful for that personally. Yes, I know it means that churches today can't be absolutely certain that they've got the right model. In fact, it means that there are many models. But the great thing about the church originally having no blueprint was that it was grounded in experience of God, not theory. Such theories as exist developed later. How did the church see itself? Initially, as just a sect within Judaism. It had nothing else to go on to start with. As if Christians were just Jews, distinguishable only by thinking Jesus was the Messiah. A hint of change came with the fact that Nicholas of Antioch, one of the deacons, was a proselyte. That's a convert to Judaism. So, there was a Christian not born a Jew. Then another deacon, Philip, finds himself transported outside Jerusalem, where he encounters an Ethiopian court official and, when challenged as to what hindered it, proceeded to baptize the man. Acts attributes the whole event to the direction of the Holy Spirit. That had to be the case because no one else would have sanctioned it. For that man couldn't enter Christianity via Judaism. He couldn't because he couldn't be circumcised. He was a eunuch. Conservatives were outraged. But then Peter, to his own astonishment, finds himself baptizing Cornelius, a Gentile. Why? Because it was evident the man had already received the Holy Spirit. You see what's happening. The Holy Spirit was leading them into truth, leading to the realization that Christians needn't be Jews first. Then another deacon, Stephen, went further, insisting, note the combination, insisting the church was heir to the Old Testament and independent of Judaism. Yeah, how is that possible? Doesn't the Old Testament link the church to Judaism? No, Stephen answered. Why? Because, according to Stephen, the Jews had forfeited the link. Judaism had corrupted its own heritage. It had become untrue to God. It's radical criticism like that, denunciation indeed of Judaism, that triggered Stephen's martyrdom. It's that, the insistence that the Christians, the church, was the true heir, the only heir to the Old Testament, that was making Christianity so provocative. And now, 44 AD, the Jewish religious leaders, unable to strike themselves on any great scale, they could now do so through Agrippa. So who was Agrippa? He's sent as a boy to Rome. He grows up intimate with the imperial family. And consequently, when one of them, Gaius Caligula, becomes emperor in 37, Agrippa is appointed king of Syria. 2 years later, he trumps up charges against his uncle, gets the uncle exiled to France and replaces him, becoming king of Galilee and Perea as well. Of Galilee, Jewish territory, would the Jews accept him? His grandfather, Herod the Great, was an Edomite, but his grandmother, Mariamne, had been a Jewish princess, granddaughter of Hyrcanus, last of the Maccabean rulers. Unlike most Herods, most of the Herod clan, Agrippa could claim some Jewish blood, and he played it to the hilt. The Mishnah, the Jewish writings, report that when required as king to read the law on the Feast of the Tabernacles, he got to the second verse of the passage in Deuteronomy and began to weep. The verse is, "And no foreigner shall be put over you who is not your brother." Seeing his tears, the Mishnah records, the crowd shouted, "No, you are our brother." And Agrippa fulfilled their trust. Caligula had become increasingly mad. He wanted to be worshipped. Philo, the Alexandrian Jewish leader, took a deputation to Rome, only to be told by Caligula, shouted at by Caligula, "No use saying that you sacrifice on my behalf. It's to someone else. It must be to me." In Jamnia, in western Palestine, Gentiles erected an altar. The majority Jewish population tore it down. Caligula ordered his statue should be put up in the Jerusalem temple. Petronius, legate in Syria, was sent with 2 legions to enforce this. You know those rather obscure verses in Christian writings, there are equivalents in Jewish writings, talking about an image of desolation or desecration to be set up where it should not. This is probably what it refers to. Agrippa sped to Rome. Petronius and his legions reached Acre, where the Jewish population assured him they would resist to the last man. Petronius desperately wrote back to Caligula rather than start the conflagration. Meanwhile, somehow, Agrippa persuaded Caligula to moderate. If the statue was already up, it had to stay, but if it wasn't up, okay, we'll forget it. Then Petronius' letter arrived. Caligula wrote back saying, "Commit suicide." Before the reply got to Petronius, news broke that the Praetorian Guard had had enough. They had risen and assassinated Caligula. His old, lame, inoffensive uncle, Claudius, was now to be emperor. Herod claims to have had a part in the plot. At any rate, 2 years later, Claudius makes him king of Judea as well. He's a hero to the Jews. Like the old Maccabees, he had defied Caligula and secured the sanctity of the temple. He was the Jewish star. And now, to please them further, he would attack the Christians. They had no political weight, no allies. Rome would not befriend them. The church was easy game. Also, virtually all the church was in his reach. Even its outpost in Antioch was in territory he controlled. Later persecutions, Diocletian, for example, killed more people, far, far more. But by then the church was too widespread to be exterminated completely. But Agrippa, maybe he could have wiped out all of the church that there then was. That's the context to our passage. Let's look at a couple of details from the passage in case they weren't clear to you. Why kill James first? Check the list in John's Gospel of women at the cross. You will find there Mary and her sister, unnamed. Cross-check the lists in other Gospels and you'll discover the name. It's the same as the wife of Zebedee, mother of James and John. Now that means James and John are Jesus' cousins on his mother's side, his nearest relatives. I think that explains a couple of incidents that otherwise are a little vague. For example, why does Jesus leave Mary to John's keeping? Well, if John's her nephew, it makes perfect sense. Also, why is it that John's Gospel doesn't name Mary's sister? Oh, it's the same modesty by which John doesn't name himself, but only refers to himself indirectly as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And also, remember that moment when James and John, prompted by their mother, had asked Jesus for seats at his right and left hand? What more natural than if, besides being leading disciples, they were also his closest family? I think it also explains why Agrippa goes for James first. As for the passage's military details, the prison was most probably the Antonia Tower. That's by the corner of the temple, a Roman stronghold. 4 guards, 1 is chained to the prisoner, 1 stands by, 2 are at the door. They're rotated in 4 groups of 3 hours each throughout the night. As for Peter's considering where to go, well, he needs to escape the city fast. Barnabas, John Mark's relative, it was John Mark's and his mother's house. Barnabas was a much-travelled Christian. I guess Peter's best hope of getting away quickly would be found by talking to someone in Mark's circle, therefore. Where the other place he went to is, I don't know. You probably do know that in Oxford and Cambridge, the 2 universities each refer to the other as the other place, but I'm sure it wasn't there that Peter went. We don't actually know where he went then. He does reappear a couple of times later, and in the 2nd century various stories grow up on which we can put more or less weight. But he has to disappear fast, and it's understandable that we're not told why. He would still have been a target. But those are footnotes. Really, what this passage is about is supernatural intervention. Something entirely reasonable, given belief in God. A God who's not just creator. Well, Christians don't believe that, or at least not just that. A creator could make the world and just leave it be. Christians believe in a God who is creator and loving Father. Someone, not an absentee Father, someone who interacts with us all the time and for our good. Granted the conception of God like that, supernatural intervention is not at all unreasonable. What's the classic case against miracles? In English, it was put by David Hume. It runs as follows. Hume is a great philosopher, but this is poor reasoning. Our knowledge is based on experience, says Hume, which is commonly repeated experience. So, reports of irregular events, such as purported miracles, are always unlikely to be true. They must arise from mistakes or illusions. Oh, don't be worried by Hume's argument at all. You notice the sleight of hand, how he slips from describing miracles in one way to another. They start off uncommon events, unlikely events, improbable events, incredible events, unbelievable events. All he's done is shuffle words. There's no real argument there at all. And anyway, Hume's position is long past its sell-by date. Mathematicians, I gather, no longer take such a simple view of probability. Scientists, far from abjuring irregularity, in many contexts embrace it. And besides, some of us have actually witnessed miracles. As for illusions, they occur when people mistake what they see for something familiar or something they're expecting. The New Testament events aren't like that at all. It's almost always the opposite. Mary Magdalene at the tomb, disciples walking to Emmaus, Thomas. They don't recognize the person with whom they were familiar. To begin with, they don't recognize him at all. It's only through his acts that they are shown who he is. Our passage tonight, though, is full of illusions. Did you notice them? Not where Hume would have us think, but in the opposite places. Where are the illusions in our passage? Peter, imagining he's dreaming. Rosie and the others thinking it must be an angel. People thinking Rosie mad. Those are the illusions. The supernatural in our passage, far from being the illusory elements, is what lifted the people out of those illusions. So what benefits came of this episode, Peter's release? And, in case you think I've forgotten the title of the talk, what good is the church? The two greatest benefits are so important we can state them very briefly. The threat of the original disciples dying prompted the writing of the Gospels. John Mark, he whose house it was, became the interpreter of Peter, so it's described by an early church historian, Papias, basing his Gospel on the accounts that the older disciple told him. And the second benefit, when Peter and the other disciples fled Jerusalem, something fundamental shifted in Christianity. No longer could the church be thought of as located geographically. It ceased to be centered somewhere. Rather, the church became wherever the gospel was taken and witnessed to. And what good was the church? I chose the passage so we'd see the church long before it became an institution. Yes, it has flowered into an institution, some aspects good, some a bit regrettable. But we want to look not at the later flowering, we want to look at the seed. And what was the seed? Individual people. Peter, Rosie, John Mark, his mother, Barnabas, and so on, the people at the house. People not in control, muddled, confused, powerless in the face of severe threat, with no very clear organization. People really not so very different from each of us, deep down. But I was unfair to those early Christians earlier when all I did was talk about their not knowing what to do. Unfair, not because that was inaccurate, but because I didn't emphasize the one thing they were doing right, that all outweighed all their muddle. They prayed. Their strength, on this occasion their only strength, was to put themselves in God's hands. That, at bottom, is what constitutes the good of the church. And where, in case someone asks, where in all this is Jesus? The passage doesn't mention him. Doesn't it? Read the passage again. He saturates the passage. It was Passover season. Peter, in prison, must have recalled it was the anniversary of when, a decade or so, probably 11 years before, he'd fallen asleep at Passover, had tried to fight at Gethsemane, and, being met by a maid and recognized by his voice, had then caved in, declaring, "I never knew the man." Meanwhile, in the house, Passover season, the Christians there would, amidst all their anxieties, have celebrated the Lord's Supper and remembered his dying for them. Indeed, you know, this may have been the very building in which the Last Supper was held. Why do I say that? You recall a youth stripped of his cloak who fled from Gethsemane naked. Since that curious detail is recorded only in Mark's Gospel, scholars incline to the view that actually it was John Mark who was the youth. If so, how come he'd accompanied the disciples to the garden? Was it because they were all going from his house? It's a very plausible conjecture, but if so, this house in our story was where the Last Supper had been, and it could well be another reason why Peter had found his sanctuary there. Finally, keep in mind why God does miracles. Over and above whatever immediate good is done, miracles are pointers to display, to reassure us as to God's power, a power ultimately directed to what? To our salvation. So in each of us, there's the potential for the big miracle. As a student, I read in the literature of the early church fathers and subsequently was delighted to find the same point in Robinson Crusoe. that the greatest miracle isn't any of the external ones, it's the internal one. It's the miracle of being saved. How dramatically that comes about and how dramatic its effects are, well, that varies enormously from one person to another. But you know, in each and every case, it makes the angels of heaven rejoice. People seeing their need and responding to God's wish to fulfill it. Last time I spoke here, I ended with a line of Kierkegaard's. I like him, but don't think he's my absolute favourite if I end with him again. Scribbled in a book I filched from my sister 40 years ago, it says, "It is our need of God that is our greatest perfection."